Hey guys, welcome back to a new video, and in this video we are going to write unit testing for our search recipe app. In our previous video we saw how to create multi-modular architecture project in Android. Now in this video we are going to write unit testing for that project. Well, the question is, what is unit testing? As a developer, it is our responsibility to make our app more robust and more optimized so that it will never crash into the production. And due to that reason, we are having various testing technique, and within that technique, we have unit testing. So in this video, we are going to deep dive into unit testing and write one by one in our code unit testing to check whether our logics or codes is well optimized or not. So without wasting any time, let's get started. And the thing is, why it is called unit testing is because in the project we have a lot of codes and we only test piece of a code, and due to that reason we called this testing technique a unit testing. In next video we are going to discuss UI testing, and UI testing is also called integration testing because we're gonna test all of the user flow. So without wasting any time, let's get started and see how we can write our unit testing for this particular project. So we will begin with our unit testing. So first I'm gonna use my search feature, and with this feature we are having three layers: data, domain, and presentation. So I'm gonna start my unit testing from this data layer. Within this data layer we are having a repository, so we will begin with our repository testing. So for that, go to this class and simply press alt enter, select this create test, press enter, and you will see this dialog. So this dialog is eventually used to set up your test class. So I'm gonna use JUnit 4. If you want to use any other testing library, you can use it, but for me I'm gonna use JUnit 4. You can give the class name. If you want to use any setup or tear down function, you can check this particular section and simply press OK. And next it will ask you where do you want to generate this test class. So for me, I'm gonna use my feature search, and we are having data layer, and within this data layer I'm gonna use my unit test module, and within this module I'm gonna select this package. Simply press OK. All right, so here you can write your test cases. So before writing any test cases, let us go into our build.gradle.kts and here add few dependencies. So first dependency is for my testing coroutines. Second is our Mockito, sync your project. Test implementation means these two dependencies is only available in your test package. Over here, go to this repository, search repository implementation test, and here we will begin with our testing. Now if you open search repository implementation, so here we are having get recipe function, and we will begin our unit testing for this function. So this function has a lot of use cases, so we can see one by one. So first, what will happen if our response is successful? Then we should check if our mails is not null. Then we will simply convert a list of recipe DTO into list of recipe and eventually use a result.success and return it. If our mails is null, then we are returning failure. If our response is not successful, eventually we return failure. And if our search API service.get recipes throw an exception, will catch and return result.failure. So we are having a lot of use cases here, so we're gonna write test cases for them one by one. So first I'm gonna use success. So test function. So this test annotation is used to create a test case. So here I am testing this success event. Run test. So this run test coroutine builder is used to build a coroutine that we're gonna use for testing. Now if I'm gonna create a repository requirement is search API service and recipe data access object. In production we are receiving these two things from Dagger Hilt, but in testing we don't have Dagger Hilt. So for that I'm gonna create search API service here. Type would be search API service, and I'm gonna use mock. So we will discuss what is mock and why do we use it over here. So don't worry about it, just give me few minutes for that. So recipe DAO simply use mock. Now I'm gonna pass my search API service and recipe DAO here. Okay, now I'm gonna hit my repository.get recipe function, and my query will be chicken, and I'm gonna create a variable naming response and store the outcome from this function to this variable. All right, now if you open this get recipe function, here we are having search API service dot get recipe. That means we will hit this particular function from search API service in order to get data back from backend. Now in our test case, we are using mock here. So by using mock, you can eventually return fake when search API service.getRecipe hit by our repository.getRecipes. So for that, I'm using here mockito1, and when this search API service.getRecipe that has chicken as a query, so if this function will call within this function, then I'm going to return something. So what we are going to return, we're going to return here response.success, code will be 200, and for the data I'm going to copy paste fake data. So this is a function that eventually give me fake data, and I'm going to use it over here. So get recipe response. So if our repository.getRecipe function will hit search API service.getRecipes, then we will return this as a response. So this is a use case of mock. And if you are not using mocks, then you can't return anything if this function will hit within your repository.getRecipe function. So due to this reason, we use mocks. And in unit testing, eventually if you are testing search repository implementation, that means in your unit test cases only the search repository implementation is original. The rest of the things is either mock or fake. So now I'm gonna use here assert equals. So this will eventually check whether the expected result or the result that we are receiving from function is equivalent or not. If it is not, that means our test fails. If it is equal, that means our test case will pass. So now from the function we are receiving this response, and within this response we are having get or throw. All right, now I'm gonna use a get recipe response, use its meals, and with the help of domain mapper I'm gonna map this recipe DTO list into a list of recipes. Now when I execute this test case, you can see our test case will pass. So this is a very simple test, and this is the unit testing. It's a very simple thing. So let's write few more test cases. So I'm gonna write here test null meal from backend, run test. Again I'm gonna use here mockito1 search API service dot get recipes, and in place of query I'm gonna pass chicken. Then I'm gonna return recipe response. So this recipe response is eventually coming in our response body. So for that I'm gonna use here a response dot success, code will be 200, and in place of body I'm gonna use my recipe response. Okay, now rest of the thing is pretty much same that we did for the test success test case. So I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, pass my search API service and recipe data access object. Next I'm gonna create a response variable, repository dot get recipes, use the same query that you had used for your search API service dot get recipe over here. All right, so now it's time to perform the assertion. So here we are receiving error. So if you notice in our search repository implementation, if our meal is null, then we are getting result failure with exception that has a message error occurred. So I'm gonna copy this message, come back to my test case, and here I'm gonna use message error occurred. So within our assert equals I'm gonna use message, and within our response we are having exception or null, and if its message is equivalent to our message, that means our test case will pass. All right, so it's done. So our test case will pass. Now go to your search repository implementation. So we eventually write test case for this and for this. Now what will happen if our search API service dot get recipe response is not successful? Then we are receiving this from this function. So go to your search repository implementation, and here I'm gonna create one more test case, and this time I'm gonna test backend response fails. Run test, I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, use my search API service and recipe data access object. So when I'm gonna hit my search API service dot get recipes with chicken as a query, return not throw, I'm gonna use then return and use my response error pass code 404, and in place of response body I'm gonna use here response body.create. Content type will be null, and in place of body I'm gonna pass empty string. Now I'm gonna create variable response, and by the using of repository I will hit my get recipes, and the query will be chicken. Okay, now again I'm gonna use assert equals, and we are expecting here. So if you open up search repository implementation, again we are receiving this same error message, which is error occurred. Go here, simply paste it. This is my expectation, and this expectation will fulfill by my response exception or null dot message. Execute it. Our test case will pass. Now what will happen if our remote data source will throw an exception? So for that I'm gonna write one more test case. So function test backend will throw exception. So run test. When our search API service dot get recipes with query chicken will hit, then I'm gonna throw, and this time I'm gonna throw a runtime exception, and the message would be error. I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, search API service, and recipe data access object, and just below to it I'm gonna use one more variable response repository get recipes. Make sure to use exact same query that you are using here in your mock. Alright, so now it's time to perform the assertion. So expectation is error. So this is a message that we are receiving from my exception, and I'm gonna use my response dot exception or null and simply use its message. Execute it. Alright, so our test case will pass. Now go back to your search repository implementation, and on the bottom we are having get recipe detail. So it is pretty much same implementation wise. So here you can see we hit our get recipe detail API, and if our response is successful we check if our mail is not null, and within this we are checking if it is not empty, then only we're gonna convert this list of recipe data into recipe detail and eventually use result.success and return it. If it is not the case, then we will return failure, and if our mail is null, then I'm gonna return the failure. Similarly, if our response is not successful, we return failure, and if our remote API will throw an exception, we'll catch and return back the failure. So it's a very simple implementation of get recipe details. So now let's write test cases for this. So go to your search repository implementation, and here I'm gonna write my first test, which is test success recipe details. When our search API service dot get recipe detail having mail ID will call, then I'm gonna return. So here I'm gonna use a response.success, code is 200, and in place of body I'm gonna use get recipe details. So this is a function that is present over here. Okay, go to our test case, and here I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, search API service, recipe data access object. Second is our response. So a repository get recipe detail, pass the same ID that you was using over here. Okay, now I'm gonna perform the assertion. So here my response is having a body that is recipe details. Now my expectation is, so I'm gonna use my get recipe details, and within this we are receiving mails. Grab its first recipe detail and eventually convert it into recipe details. So this is the exact same thing that we were doing in this function over here. Alright, so execute this test case, and test case will pass. Now it's time to write the another test case. So test success with empty list. So when our search API service dot get recipe detail mail ID is triggered, then I'm gonna return response dot success, code will be 200, and in place of recipe detail I'm gonna simply return here a recipe detail response. Alright, so within this we are having mails, and by default mail is null, so for that I'm gonna use here empty list. Again, I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, pass my search API service and REST DAO. Next, I'm having another variable to hold my response. So repository get recipe detail, you can pass your ID and make sure ID is exactly same that you are using over here. Now it's time to perform the assertion. So in assertion, if you open up this search repository implementation, if we are receiving mail, if it is not null and if it is empty, then we go over here and our error message would be error occurred. So I'm gonna grab this thing, come back to my test case, and this is my expectation, and from my response exception or null message, I believe we are receiving exact same thing. Execute. Alright, so our test case will pass. So now we have written test case for this and this. So now it's time to write test case for this thing. So this thing is possible when you are receiving mail null from the backend. So let's do that. So for that, I'm gonna create a test case function test success with null mail. Run test. So when our search API service dot get recipe detail will trigger having mail ID, let me make some space. Then I'm gonna return. So return type would be response dot success 200 and response would be recipe detail response. By default our mail is null. Now again I'm gonna create my repository, which is search repository implementation, pass your search API service recipe data access object, and here I'm gonna create a variable response. For repository get recipe details, you can pass your ID over here. Now I'm gonna perform the assertion. So if it is null, then we go over here and the message would be error occurred. Come back to our search repository implementation, simply use it, and from the response exception or null message we are receiving the exact same thing. So execute it. Alright, so our test case is passed. Now go back to your search repository implementation. So now it's a very good time to write test case for this. So if we are receiving something wrong from the backend, then we eventually come up over here. So message is same. I'm gonna copy the message, come back to my search repository implementation test, and here I'm gonna write my test. So test function test failed from backend. So my naming convention is not very good. You can do by yourself. You can give the name whatever you want, whatever suits for your test case. So run test. So when my search API service dot get recipe detail will hit having mail ID, then I'm gonna return, and this time I'm gonna return response dot error, and the code will be 404, and in place of response body I'm gonna use a response body dot create. Content type would be null and the body is empty string. Next I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, pass your search API service and REST data access object. I'm gonna create one more variable naming response, use my repository get recipe detail and pass the ID, and lastly I'm gonna perform the assertion. So in assertion I'm gonna use here error occurred, and this will be coming from my response exception or null dot message. Execute it. Alright, so our test case will pass. So now what will happen if our backend remote data source will throw an exception? So for that I'm gonna write a test case, test backend throw exception, and I'm gonna use a run test here. So first thing first, I'm gonna create my repository, search repository implementation, and I'm gonna pass my search API service and REST data access object. So when our search API service dot get recipe detail having mail ID will trigger, then I'm gonna throw an runtime exception. So this runtime exception contain message error. And lastly, I'm gonna create a response variable which ultimately use my repository get recipe detail function, and I'm gonna pass my mail ID. Now I'm gonna perform the assertion. So I believe I will receive the error message from my exception, and this ultimately coming from a response dot exception or null dot message. Execute it. Alright, so our test case will pass. Now go back to your repository again. So we are pretty much done with our get recipe function and get recipe detail function. Now it's time to check these three functions like insertion, deletion and get all recipes. So for that I'm gonna write few other test cases. So first thing first, I'm gonna use here fakes. So in the beginning of this video I told you in our testing we use two things, either we use mock or fake. So mock we already saw, this is mock. Now it's time to see how to use fakes. So to use fakes, first thing first, go to the package, here it is, and I'm gonna write implementation for my recipe data access object because we're gonna use that. So for that I'm gonna create a new class and I'm gonna call this fake recipe data access object. So this is a class and eventually it will implement my recipe data access object. Control I, implement everything. So on the top I'm gonna create a variable naming list, which is a mutable list of recipe, and when user want to insert something, then I'm gonna use my list and add that item to my list. Similarly, in case of deletion, I'm gonna use my list, simply use remove and pass my element. So in place of get all recipes, I'm gonna use a cold flow, which is flow of, and eventually I'm gonna return my list and use a return keyword over here. So updation logic is a little more complex. For the time being, I'm not writing anything about the update recipes because we don't use that function. So just leave it, no worries of this function. Go to your search repository implementation test, and here I'm gonna begin my writing testing. So first I'm gonna write the insert. I'm gonna use a run test. First thing first, I'm gonna create my repository, which is search repository implementation, pass my search API service, and in place of recipe DAO, this time I'm gonna pass my fake recipe data access object. So now I'm gonna use my repository insert recipe function, and before inserting any recipe here, I'm gonna create that recipe. So val recipe, so get a recipe response, this will contain meals, and I'm gonna use to domain in order to convert this list of DTO into a list of recipe, and I'm gonna grab the first element of that. Let's use question mark here and simply use a recipe. So I'm sure this is never null. All right, so now it's time to perform the assertion. So through our fake recipe data access object, we are having get all a recipe naming function, which eventually return me a flow. So here I'm gonna pass my recipe. So eventually I assume that my get all recipes function will return me a recipe that we had inserted over here. All right, and here I'm gonna use my repository get all recipes, which eventually return back flow, and I'm gonna use its first emission. Now execute this test case, and test case fails because expectation is this, and we are receiving a list of, basically this first will give me the first emission from the flow, not the first item from the list. So if you open up the get all recipes, the fake one, fake recipe data access object, so here you can see in the get all recipe we wrap list with flow. That means if we are using first operator, it will eventually give me the first flow, not the first item from the list. So go to your search repository implementation test. So this will eventually give me the first emission, and I'm gonna use here the first item. Now execute this test case again, and this time it will pass. So we saw insertion logic over here, and similarly I'm gonna write one more logic for the deletion. So function test delete, and this time I'm gonna use, so first I'm gonna create my repository search API service and fake recipe data access object. Next I'm gonna create a recipe. So this recipe eventually use my get recipe response. Within this we are having meals, and I'm gonna convert this list of DTO into a list of recipes by the help of to domain mapper function, and I'm gonna use its first element. So first I'm gonna insert it. Now I'm gonna fetch the elements from my fake recipe data access object. So I'm gonna call this list, and here I'm gonna use my repository get all recipe function, collect its first emission, and from its first emission I'm gonna grab the first element from that list. All right, so now it's time to perform the deletion. So repository dot delete recipe, pass your recipe. That means up to this particular line we have one element, like recipe list dot. Okay, so we are actually using here first element. Now when we delete that particular item from our database, that means there is no item present in our fake recipe data access object. So now I'm gonna write another assertion. So this assertion will verify that there are no element present in our fake recipe data access object list. So for that I'm gonna use here empty list, and type would be our recipe. I'm gonna use a repository get all recipes and its last emission. Now the logic of this function would be, first we're gonna insert something in our fake recipe data access object, then we again fetch and see whether that particular insert item will be there or not. If it is there, that means our first assertion will pass here. Next I'm going to delete that thing and then again check. If it is empty, then that means we are deleting that recipe from our data access object. So now execute it. Alright, so our test case passed. That means our insertion and deletion is perfectly working. There is no need to write get all recipe function test cases, because we are already used that thing in our insert and delete test cases. So there is no need to write that test case. So we are pretty much done with our data layer. We wrote unit test cases for our repository. Now it's time to move on with our domain layer. And in our domain layer, we are mostly having use cases. So for me, I'm gonna write unit test cases for our use cases in our domain layer. So let's begin with this. So for that, go to your domain layer, and this domain layer contain use cases package, and this will contain 5 different use case. So I'm gonna write get all recipe use case unit testing and get recipe detail use case unit testing. So get recipe detail use case unit testing will be on you. You can write that test cases by yourself because it's very similar and it's very easy. So let's begin with our get all recipe use case unit testing. So for that, again, put your cursor onto this get all recipe use case class name. Simply press Alt Enter and use create test. It will show you this kind of dialog. You can choose the testing library. So for me, I'm going to use GA unit 4, and you can give the class name by yourself. So here it is giving me get all recipe use case test. So it's fine for me. And you can use this setup and tear down functions. So we will discuss what is the use case of these things. Okay. So don't worry about it. So for me, I'm gonna simply press OK, and it will ask you the location where you wanna create this test case. So for me, I'm gonna use feature search domain layer, and this will contain this unit test module, and this will have this package, and I'm gonna create my test class into this package. So simply click OK. All right. So first thing first, let's add few dependencies. So go to your build.gradle.data layer over here and simply copy this thing, paste it in your domain layer Gradle, sync your project, come back to your test class, which is get all recipe use case test. All right, so now I'm gonna write my first test case, which is success one. So test success. I'm gonna use a run test. So first thing first, I'm gonna create my use case, which is get all recipe use case, and the requirement of this thing is search repository. So we're gonna use mock here again. So private val search repository type would be search repository mock. Import this mock. Now this is a test success, so I'm gonna use here mockito when search repository get recipes. I'm gonna use my query as chicken, and if it will hit, then I will return something, and I'm gonna copy paste the mocks that we're gonna use here. All right, so these are the mocks that we will use in this test case. So we have get recipe response, which eventually return me list of recipes, and we are having get recipe detail, which will gives us recipe details. So now come back here. So this search repository dot get recipe has a return type result list of recipes. So I'm gonna use here result dot success, and I'm gonna use my get recipe response. So it will give me list of recipe, and I'm gonna pass my search repository here. So this is for our success. So now I'm gonna use my use case and call this invoke function and pass my query, which is chicken. Make sure to use the same query as we are using in our mocks. All right, so it's time to assert few things. So assert equals import it. So first parameter value would be expectation. So I expect I am receiving a get recipe response, and this will eventually coming from my UseCase.invoke function. So here I'm gonna create variable naming a response, and I'm gonna use it. So a response, and this will eventually give me a flow. So this flow has first emission. So first emission, if you open my use case, the first emission would be always loading. So I'm gonna use the last emission. So last emission always would be either success or the error. Okay, and here you can see it will give me network result dot success, and within this we are having our actual data. So go to your test case again, and here we are using last emission, last, and I assume that we are receiving some data from the search repository. Now it's time to execute this test case. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. Now we are done with our success. Let's deal with our second test case, which is failing. Again, similar approach. So when our search repository dot get recipe having query chicken will hit, then I'm gonna return my result dot failure, and I'm gonna pass runtime exception that has message error. Now I'm gonna create my use case, which is get all recipe use case, pass my search repository, and I'm gonna create one more variable naming response, in which I'm gonna store my response. So invoke, pass your query. Make sure query will be exactly same which you are using over here in the mocks. Alright, so now it's time to write the assertion. So in assertion, we are assuming that we will receive this error message from our use case. So here I'm gonna use my response. It's last emission, and this will contain message. Okay, so simply execute it. Okay, our test case will pass. Now the third case is suppose your search repository dot get recipe will throw an exception. Then on that scenario, we will catch it and simply return back the message that our exception will contain. So for that, go to get all recipe use case, and here I'm gonna write test function test exception. You can give the name whatever you want, but for me I'm using these kind of names. So run test when our search repository dot get recipes having query chicken will trigger, then I'm gonna throw an exception. Again, I'm gonna use a runtime exception with same message, which is error. I'm gonna create my use case, which is get all recipe use case, pass my search repository. Next, I'm gonna store my response into this variable. So use case invoke, pass chicken over here. And now it's time to write the assertion. So I'm gonna use assert equals, and I assume that my function will give me error message from the exception, and this will eventually coming up from my response dot last, because I'm gonna use the last emission, and here we are having message. Simply execute it. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. So we are pretty much done with our get all recipe use case unit testing. Now it's on you. You will write the unit testing for my get recipe detail use case. So it's very easy. It's very similar. You can do it by yourself. Now we will move with our UI layer, and in our UI layer we mostly write unit testing for our view models, because in composable we are having UI, and for that we will write UI testing. So now let's move on our UI layer. And here we are having three different screen, which is a recipe list screen, favorite screen, and detail screen. So we're gonna write recipe detail view model, favorite view model, and recipe list view model test cases one by one. So let's begin with our recipe list view model. Alright, so let's begin with our view model testing. So first we will test our recipe list view model. So simply press Alt Enter and create your test, and accept all the suggestion that it will provide you. So press OK, and make sure to choose the correct package. So within our feature search UI layer we are having unit test, so choose this package. Simply press OK. It will generate a class for you. Now open up your recipe list view model, and here on the bottom we are having events. So basically we are having three different events: search recipe, go to recipe details and favorite screen. So these two are the navigation events. So for this we have one unit test cases. For the search recipe we are having two different unit testing. The first one is for the success case and the second one is for the error case. So let's write the test cases for this first. So go to your recipe list view model, and here I'm going to create my test, which is function test the success one. Okay, so run test. I'm going to create my view model, which is recipe list view model, and the requirement of this thing is get all recipe use case. So on the top I'm going to create a variable naming get all recipe use case, which is this one. Type would be get all recipe use case, and initialize this thing with mock. Alright, so when our get all recipe use case dot invoke will trigger with query chicken, then I'm gonna return data. So this data is a flow of network result dot success, and I'm gonna copy paste the data that I will use in this unit testing. Alright, so this is our function get recipe response and get recipe details. So it will eventually return you a list of recipe, and this will give you recipe details. So let's use that. So get recipe response. Alright, so requirement of this view model would be get all recipe use case. So when our view model dot on event that has event in it, so make sure this event is coming from your recipe list package, and within this we are having search recipe. Make sure to use the exact same query that you were using in the mock. Alright, so now it's time to perform the assertion. So assert equals import it. So the first parameter would be the expected result that you want. So I believe that it will give me get recipe response, and this will eventually present in my UI state, because in the recipe list view model on the top we are having search. So this will trigger when we are passing the event search recipe. So it will ultimately update my UI state. So that's the reason. And this thing will actually contain a value, and within this value we are having data. Now execute this test case. So this test case will fail, and the reason behind this is main dispatcher is not set up properly. So under the hood ViewModel scope.launch uses dispatcher main, and here in our testing we don't set up that main dispatcher, and due to this reason our test case will fail. Now let's see how we can set up our main dispatcher in the testing. So in order to do that, you can simply use here dispatcher.setMain and pass unconfined test dispatcher. Why you are not using standard test dispatcher here? Because unconfined test dispatcher execute the coroutine eagerly. This is the reason why I'm using unconfined test dispatcher. Now once you are done with our test case, then you can simply reset the main. Now when you execute this unit test case, it will pass. So instead of writing this thing again and again for all the test cases, you can create a separate class for that and add this thing as a rule. So let's create a class naming main dispatcher rule, and within this we are having a constructor parameter test dispatcher is test dispatcher and initialize with unconfined test dispatcher. This will extend test watcher. So here we are having two functions. The first one is starting. So in the starting I'm gonna set my main with test dispatcher, and once it will finished I'm gonna use my dispatcher main to reset the main. Alright, so now I'm gonna use this thing in a form of rule. So simply copy it. On the top you can use rule. So get colon rule while main dispatcher rule. Alright, so what is the use case of this rule? Well, when you press this button, or you can say when you execute your test cases, first it will go and set up all the rules which is present over here. Alright, and after that we are having two more blocks, which is before and after. So once you hit this button, first it will go and set up all the rule. So this rule is also having order. So if you are having more than one rule, then you can give the order, and based on that it will execute the rules. Alright, so once the rule will be set up properly, then it will execute this block. So this before block is eventually used to set up all the initial things, and after that your test case will execute. Once your test case will execute properly, then it will execute the after block in order to release the memory. So this is the order of the execution. So first our rule will execute, set up all the rules. After that it will execute before, then your test case will run properly, and at the end it will execute the after block. Alright, so I'm gonna remove this dispatcher main and dispatcher.preset main and now execute my test case. So it will pass properly. Now it's time to write the failed one. So fun test failed. Okay, so here I'm gonna use a run test wall view model, which is recipe list view model. Requirement is get all recipe use case. So when our get all recipe use case dot invoke having query chicken will trigger, then I'm gonna return flow of network result dot error, and this time we have message and I'm gonna pass here error. Alright, now I'm gonna use view model on event and simply pass the event, which is search recipe, and pass my query, which is not chicky, it's chicken. And lastly I'm gonna use assert equals, and I believe I'm receiving a UI text dot remote string, and within this the message would be error, and this will present in my view model UI state value dot error. Alright, so execute this test case and it will pass eventually. Now open up your recipe list view model and go to the bottom. Here we are having two more different events. So this event is eventually used to navigate, and on the top we are having navigation. So this is a channel, and ultimately I'm using receive as flow, which will convert this flow into a hot flow. So let's see how we can write unit test cases for hot flows. So go here and start the test cases. So the first test case would be function test navigate to recipe details, run test wall view model, and we are having recipe list view model. Requirement is get all recipe use case, and here I'm gonna use the on event function and pass my event. So this event is coming from my recipe list, and here we are having go to recipe details, and you can pass your meal ID. And now I'm gonna write a list which is a mutable list of, and the type would be navigation, and this navigation make sure is coming from my recipe list package. Alright, so now it's time to write a hot flow testing. So I'm gonna use here background scope dot launch, and I'm gonna use unconfined dispatcher because of the behavior of eagerly execution. And view model navigation collect the latest emissions and simply add those emissions into my list. And on the bottom I'm gonna use here assert. So if our list dot first value is a type of navigation which is present in our recipe list and recipe details, that means we successfully perform the navigation. Execute it. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. Similarly, I'm gonna write another test case. So this test case is for the alright, so I'm gonna use a run test, create my view model, which is recipe list view model, pass your use case, view model on event, and this time the event would be event. Make sure this is coming from recipe list, and we are having here favorite screen. Alright, so again create list, mutable list of, type would be navigation, make sure coming from recipe list. Background scope launch, I want to launch this coroutine onto the unconfined test dispatcher, and view model navigation collect the latest emission, simply add those emission into my list. Alright, simply perform the assertion. So list dot first this time is a type of navigation dot go to favorite screen, run the test case, and it will pass eventually. Go to the top, and if you want to execute all the test case at once, you can simply click here. Alright, so all the test case will pass successfully. Now it's time to write the test case for our recipe detail view model. So open up this recipe detail view model, go to the bottom. Here we are having events. Okay, So in our fetch recipe details, we are having two different unit testing. The first one is for the success case and the second one is for the error case. We are having here insert, delete. So this is basically a single unit testing. And for our recipe list screen and go to media player. So we are performing a navigation. That means we have to write only one unit test cases for each. So totally we are having here 6 unit testing. So let's get started. So go to the top recipe detail view model. So here you can simply press Alt Enter and create your test. Simply accept everything, press OK and choose the correct package, which is feature search UI unit test package. Alright, so here it will create, and first thing first, I'm gonna add the main dispatcher rule which is present in my recipe list view model test, and also I'm gonna use these functions. So simply copy it, come back to your recipe detail view model, and at the end you can paste everything. Alright, so first thing first, before writing anything, I'm gonna add the rule, main dispatcher rule, which is main dispatcher rule. Okay, so now I'm gonna begin with my fetch recipe details. So for that I'm gonna write my test function test success run test while view model, which is a recipe details view model, and the requirement of this thing is 3 different use cases. So go to your recipe detail view model and grab all these use cases, come back to your test cases, and here I'm gonna simply paste it and initialize every use case with the help of mock. Import this mock, pass all the use cases in your recipe detail view model. So when is coming from my Mockito library, so when our get recipe detail use case dot invoke will trigger with mail id, then I'm gonna return flow of, and here I'm having a network result success, and in place of data I'm gonna use my get recipe details. Alright, so after the view model creation, I'm gonna use view model on event, and I'm gonna use the event. This event is coming from my recipe details, and within this we are having fetch recipe details, and make sure you can pass the ID that you are using in your mock over here. Alright, that means now our UI state is updated. So I'm gonna use here assert equals. So the expected thing would be get recipe details, and it will coming from my view model UI state value dot data. Execute this test case. Alright, so test case will pass successfully. Similarly, I'm gonna write one more test case for my failure. Run test, I'm gonna create my view model, which is recipe details view model. Requirement is get recipe detail, delete and insert use case. So when I will trigger get recipe detail use case dot invoke having id, then I'm gonna return a cold flow, flow of network result dot error, and the message would be error. Alright, so here I'm gonna use my view model on event, and this event is coming from my recipe details, and here I'm having my fetch recipe details. So I'm gonna use here fetch recipe detail, pass my ID. After that I will use assert equals, and I'm sure that I will receive here UI text dot remote string, and this remote string contains the message error, and this will be coming from my view model UI state value dot error. Execute this test case. Alright, so it passes successfully. Go back to your recipe detail view models. So now we are pretty much done with the fetch recipe detail use cases. Now it's time to write these navigation tests, and after that we will write the insert and delete unit test cases. So go to recipe detail view model, and let's write the go to recipe list screen first. Fun test navigate recipe list screen. Alright, so let me make some space, and here I'm gonna use run test while view model, which is a recipe detail view model, pass the constructor dependencies, and when our view model on event has event, make sure this will coming from recipe details, and here we are having go to recipe list screen. Then I'm gonna create a mutable list of type would be navigation, and this navigation is coming from my recipe details. Make sure the import is correct, otherwise you are failing your test cases before executing that test case. So I'm gonna use here background scope, launch a new coroutine, and within this I'm gonna use unconfined test dispatcher, view model, navigation, collect the latest emissions, and simply add those things in our list. In the assert, I'm gonna check my first value from list is type of navigation dot go to recipe list screen, and simply execute it. Alright, so our test case will pass. That means we will successfully perform navigation. Now let's write one more test case. So this time I'm gonna write test case to perform the navigation. So currently I'm in recipe detail view model, and from here I would go to the media player. So we have one more option to go to the media player from recipe detail view model. So let's test that. So go to media, use run test wall view model, recipe detail view model, pass the dependencies, and just below to it invoke the event. So view model dot on event, and we are having here event which is coming from recipe details. Okay, and here we are having go to media player, and make sure to pass your URL as URL. All right, so now I'm gonna perform the assertion. So before performing assertion, make sure to create a list, and this list is a type of mutable list of navigation. Make sure this import is correct, and after that I'm gonna use background scope, launch, and use unconfined test dispatcher, view model, navigation, collect the latest emissions, and simply add those emissions into our list. And now it's time to write the assertion. So here in the assertion I'm simply checking my list dot first value is a type of navigation dot go to media player. Now execute this test. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. Now it's time to write the test case for insert and delete recipe. Now go back to your recipe view model test, and here let's begin with our insert logic. So funs test insert. So first thing first, I'm gonna create a run test, and here I'm gonna use a view model which is recipe detail view model, and the requirement is get recipe detail use case, delete and insert use case. Okay, so here I'm using view model on event, and within our event we are having insert, and the requirement of this insert recipe would be recipe detail. So this recipe detail is eventually coming from get recipe detail. Okay, so we are done with our insertion. Now it's time to write the proper response from this use case. So on the insert recipe use case dot invoke, and the requirement of this thing would be a recipe. So once you open our recipe detail view model, so go to the event that we are using for the insertion. So in our on event we are having here fetch, go to recipe list, delete and insert. So in insert we are using two recipe mappers in order to map our recipe detail to recipe. So I'm gonna make this function public function. Alright, so now come back to my recipe detail view model test, and here on the top I'm gonna create a variable naming recipe. I'm using get recipe details and simply convert it into recipe. Now pass the recipe. That means if this function will trigger, then what we are going to do? Well, in that scenario I'm gonna use this then, and on the top of our recipe I'm gonna create one more variable naming recipe db. This is a mutable list of recipe. Alright, so once this function will execute, I'm gonna use my recipe db and simply add the recipe to this database, or you can say mutable list of recipe. And lastly I'm gonna return the flow, or you can say cold flow of unit. Alright, so once we hit the event, we eventually hit the function with recipe. That means our recipe db has this particular recipe. So now it's time to write the assertion. So let's write the assertion with the help of assert, and the requirement of this thing is boolean. So I'm gonna use here my recipe db and check whether this thing contain my recipe or not. If it is containing this recipe, that means our test case will execute properly and the logic is perfectly fine for the insertion. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. That means logically everything works well. Now I'm gonna perform the unit test cases for deletion. So simply I'm gonna copy this thing and paste it over here, because if you want to delete anything, there must be present a data into your database. So I'm gonna change the name from insert to delete. Now what I'm doing over here, so first I will insert the recipe into my recipe db. So when our delete recipe use case dot invoke having a recipe, so this recipe is the same recipe that we had inserted. So if this will trigger, then I'm gonna simply remove the item from my recipe db. So recipe db dot remove and simply use the element, and lastly use cold flow and type is unit. Alright, so now this time this recipe db is empty. Simply execute this test case. Alright, so our test case will fail, and the reason of this failure would be I'm not using the delete event. So for that I'm gonna use here delete event in order to perform the deletion. So make sure to use the event which is coming from a recipe details, and we are having here delete recipe. The requirement of this function is recipe details. So use my get recipe details and execute this test case. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. That means we are pretty much done with our recipe detail ViewModel testing. Go to the top and execute all the test case at once. So simply hit this button. Alright, so all the test case will pass successfully. Now it's time to write the test case for our favorite view model. So go to your favorite view model. So in our favorite view model, go to the bottom, and here we are having one navigation which is go to details. So this navigation and this navigation is pretty much same. I think I accidentally put these two navigation in this event. So apart from this, we are having delete, reset sort, list ingredient sort, and alphabetical sort. So totally we are having here 5 different unit testing. The first one is for the navigation, and the rest of the things is for the deletion, and the 3 is actually used to perform the sorting. So let's see how we can do this. So go to the top, and here in the init block we are having get recipe list. So when you click onto this get recipe list, so under the hood it uses get all recipes from the local database use case, and it will collect everything that eventually update our UI state. Alright, so let's write unit test cases for this. So now we will begin with our favorite ViewModel unit testing. So for that, go to this class name and simply press alt enter, create a test. Alright, so you are going to see this kind of pop-up. So you can give your class name, you can choose your testing library. So for me everything is fine, so I'm simply press OK, and here I'm gonna choose my package which is feature search UI unit test, and I'm gonna create my class to this package. Simply press OK. Alright, so here first thing first, I'm gonna add my rule which is main dispatcher rule again. Alright, so now here I'm gonna create my first test case. So fun test. So let me open the favorite view model again and go to the bottom. So here in my events I'm having alphabetical sort, list ingredient sort, reset that sort, and delete recipe, and these two is eventually performing the same navigation. So here totally we are having 5 different unit testing. So let's begin with our alphabetical sort. So go to your favorite view model test, and here I'm gonna call this alpha vertical sort run test, and I'm gonna create my view model which is favorite view model, and the requirement of this thing is 2 different use case: get all recipes from local db and delete recipe use case. Go back to your favorite view model, and on the top you have constructors. Simply copy this thing, come back to your test, and here I'm gonna simply paste it and use my mock to create mock simply for this. Alright, so if you open favorite model again, here you can see in the init block I'm hitting get recipe list function, and when you open this function I'm using get all recipe from local db use case and simply use invoke and collect its emission. Ultimately I'm gonna update my UI state. So for that, first thing first, go to your test case, and in our recipe list view model or recipe detail view model test, we are using these two functions. So simply copy these functions, come back to your favorite view model test case, and on the bottom simply paste it. Alright, so now I'm gonna use here before block, and within this I'm gonna use Mockito when. So when get all recipes from local database will invoke, then I'm gonna return get recipe response. So this recipe response is eventually coming up in a form of cold flow, so I'm gonna use here flow off. Alright, now I'm gonna use these. So this is for the alphabetical sort. So here I'm having event. So on event, this event is coming from my favorite screen, and here we are having alphabetical sort. Now let's write the assert equals. So get recipe response is sorted by str meal name, and if this is equivalent to our view model UI state value dot data, that means we are sorting our list alphabetically. Alright, so our test case will pass successfully. That means logically everything works well. Now I'm gonna write another test case. So this time I'm gonna test my sorting order, which is, if you go to the bottom, we are having this event, and second sorting will be based on the ingredient sort. So now I'm gonna use this thing. So less ingredient sort, run test val view model. You can simply create your favorite view model, pass your use cases, and here I'm gonna use my event. So within this I'm having event. So make sure this event is coming from my favorite screen, and yes, this time I'm gonna use less ingredient sort. In assert equals, I'm gonna use my get recipe response and use sorted by, and this thing is sort based on the str instruction dot length. Alright, so this thing is equivalent to our view model UI state value dot data. Execute this test case, and yeah, it will pass successfully. Now the third one is the reset the order. So I'm gonna write test case for that. So simply I'm gonna call this test reset sort, run test val view model favorite view model. Requirement is get all recipes from local db use case and delete recipe use case. Now I'm gonna use event view model on event favorite screen dot event dot let us suppose I'm using first alphabetical sort. Okay, and if I'm using alphabetical sort, that means this assertion will be passed. Okay, so once it will pass, I'm gonna use here view model on event, and in the event of our favorite screen we are having reset sort. So once it will reset the sort, that means if I'm having assert equals get recipe response is pretty much equal to our view model UI state value dot data. Alright, so once you run the test case, it will pass. That means yeah, logically this reset sort will work. Now if you open the view model, so on the bottom we are having events. So we are pretty much done with these three events. Now we are having two more events. The first one is delete, and second one is go to details. So let's write the detail recipe test case first. So for that I'm gonna create test and call this fun test delete, run test. So I'm gonna create my view model, and this view model is favorite view model. Requirement is these two use case. All right, so first thing first, I'm gonna create here a recipe. So this is our recipe list, which eventually act as a database. So this will be initialized from get recipe response dot to mutable list, and when our delete recipe dot invoke will trigger, that contains our recipe list dot its first item, then I'm gonna do something. So first thing first, I'm gonna use my recipe list and remove the first item, which is a recipe list from recipe list we are getting its first element, so it will ultimately removed from my recipe list. All right, now I'm gonna return a cold flow of unit. All right, so I'm gonna use ViewModel on event, and within the event make sure this is coming from priority screen. So this event has delete recipe and the requirement is a recipe. So again, this recipe is the first element of our recipe list. So I'm gonna use here recipe list dot first, and once it will execute properly, then I'm gonna write the assertion. So I'll check if my recipe list size is equivalent to 1 or not, because if you see this function has only 2 recipe in it. Now execute this test case, and yes, it will pass. That means our deletion logic will work properly. Alright, so here I am using the another test case which is for the navigation. So this time I am navigating to details. Run test. I'm gonna create my view model from favorite view model. Requirement is these 2 use cases. So once I'm gonna hit the event, and this event is make sure coming from priority screen, and within this we are having show details and pass your mail ID in it. Alright, so now I'm gonna create a list which is mutable list of type would be navigation, and this navigation is coming from priority screen. Okay, I'm gonna use background scope launch, and this coroutine will ultimately launch on the unconfined test dispatcher because of its eagerly coroutine execution property. View model navigation, correct the latest emission and simply add that emission into my list. Okay, now it's time to perform the assertion. So in assertion, I'm gonna check its first value is the type of navigation. So this navigation again is coming from my favorite screen. So here we are having go to recipe detail screen. Execute this test case, and yes, our test case will pass successfully. Alright, so now we are pretty much done with our UI layer. So in our UI layer, we mostly write unit testing for our view models. So yeah, we are pretty much done with our unit testing. Alright, so we are done with our unit testing part. So in this part, we saw how to write repository testing in our data layer, how to write use cases testing in our domain layer, and how to write view model testing in our UI layer. Now we are pretty much done. In our media player, we have nothing to write UI testing for, because in media player we have only UI layer that eventually show you a media player, or you can say YouTube player. So yeah, we are pretty much done with our unit testing. So I hope you like this video, and I assume you know everything that you want to know in order to write your own unit testing. Still, if you are facing any problem, you can write comments, and also if you like this video, you can again like the video and also subscribe the channel, so that I will upload more videos regarding Android development. And in the next video, we are going to write a UI testing for this multi-modular project. So we'll meet in our next video. Till that, you should enjoy this video, and if you like this video, so please write comments, or you can say your opinions. All right, so bye, have a good day.